Progress and Poverty. This is page 103, chapter 2, Inferences from Facts. The general acceptance of the Malthusian theory and the high authority by which it is endorsed have seemed to me to make it expedient to review its grounds and the causes which have conspired to give it such dominating influence in the discussion of social questions. But when we subject the theory itself to the test of straightforward analysis, it will, I think, be found as utterly untenable as the current theory of wages. In the first place, the facts which are marshaled in support of this theory do not prove it, and the analogies do not countenance it. And in the second place, there are facts which conclusively disprove it. I go to the heart of the matter in saying that there is no warrant, either in experience or analogy, for the assumption that there is any tendency in population to increase faster than subsistence. The facts cited to show this simply show that where, owing to the sparseness of population, as in new countries, or where, owing to the unequal distribution of wealth, as among the poorer classes in old countries, human life is occupied with the physical necessities of existence, the tendency to reproduce is at a rate which would, were it to go on unchecked, sometime exceed subsistence. But it is not a legitimate inference from this that the tendency to reproduce would show itself in the same force where population was sufficiently dense and wealth distributed with sufficient evenness to lift a whole community above the necessity of devoting their energies to a struggle for mere existence. Nor can it be assumed that the tendency to reproduce, by causing poverty, must prevent the existence of such a community. For this manifestly would be assuming the very point at issue and reasoning in a circle. And even if it be admitted that the tendency to multiply must ultimately produce poverty, it cannot from this alone be predicted of existing poverty that it is due to this cause, until it be shown that there are no other causes which can account for it. A thing in the present state of government, laws, and customs manifestly impossible. This is abundantly shown in the Essay on Population itself. This famous book, which is much oftener spoken of than read, is still well worth perusal, if only as a literary curiosity. The contrast between the merits of the book itself and the effect it has produced, or is at least credited with, for through Sir James Stewart, Mr. Townsend, and others, share with Malthus the glory of discovering the principle of population. It was the publication of the Essay on Population that brought it prominently forward, close parentheses, is, it seems to me, one of the most remarkable things in the history of literature, and it is easy to understand how Goodwin, whose political justice provoked the Essay on Population, should until his old age have disdained a reply. It begins with the assumption that population tends to increase in a geometrical ratio, while subsistence can at best be made to increase only in an arithmetical ratio, an assumption just as valid and no more so than it would be from the fact that a puppy doubled the length of his tail while he added so many pounds to his weight, to assert a geometric progression of tail and an arithmetical progression of weight. and the inference from the assumption is just such as Swift in satire might have credited to the savans of a previously dogless island, who, by bringing these two ratios together, might deduce the very striking consequence that by the time the dog grew to a weight of 50 pounds, his tail would be over a mile long and extremely difficult to wag, and hence recommend the prudential check of a bandage as the only alternative to the positive check of constant amputation. Commencing with such an absurdity, the essay includes a long argument for the imposition of a duty on the importation and the payment of a bounty for the exportation of corn, an idea that has long since been sent to the limbo of exploded fallacies. And it is marked throughout the argumentative portions by passages which show on the part of the reverend gentleman the most ridiculous incapacity for logical thought, as, for instance, that if wages were to be increased from 18 pence or 2 shillings per day to 5 shillings, meat would necessarily increase in price from 8 or 9 pence to 2 or 3 shillings per pound, and the condition of the laboring classes would therefore not be improved, a statement to which I can think of no parallel so close as a proposition I once heard a certain printer gravely advance, that because an author whom he had known was 40 years old when he was 20, the author must now be 80 years old because he, the printer, was 40. This confusion of thought does not merely crop out here and there, it characterizes the whole work. The main body of the book is taken up with what is in reality a refutation of the theory which the book advances. For Malthus's review of what he calls the positive checks to population is simply the showing that the results which he attributes to overpopulation actually arise from other causes. Of all the cases cited, and pretty much the whole globe is passed over in the survey, in which vice and misery check increase by limiting marriages or shortening the term of a human life, there is not a single case in which the vice and misery can be traced to an actual increase in the number of mouths over the power of the accompanying hands to feed them, but in every case the vice and misery are shown to spring either from unsocial ignorance and rapacity, or from bad government, unjust laws, or destructive warfare. Nor what Malthus failed to show has anyone since him shown. The globe may be surveyed and history may be reviewed in vain for any instance of a considerable country in which poverty and want can be fairly attributed to the pressure of an increasing population. Whatever be the possible dangers involved in the power of human increase, they have never yet appeared. Whatever may sometime be, this never yet has been the evil that has afflicted mankind, population always tending to overpass the limit of subsistence. How is it then that this globe of ours, after all the thousands, and it is now thought millions of years that man has been upon the earth, is yet so thinly populated? How is it then that so many of the hives of human life are now deserted, that once cultivated fields are rank with jungle, and the wild beast licks her cubs where once were busy haunts of men? I have to check on the dog because I hear her chewing something, so. Oh, maybe not. Okay, never mind. It is, in fact, that as we count our increasing millions, It is a fact that as we count our increasing millions, we are apt to lose sight of. Nevertheless, it is a fact that in what we know of the world's history, decadence of population is as common as increase. Decadence? I don't know. Of population is as common as increase. Whether the aggregate population of the earth is now greater than at any previous epoch is a speculation which can deal only with guesses. Since Montesquieu, in the early part of the last century, asserted what was then probably the prevailing impression, that the population of the earth had, since the Christian era greatly declined, opinion has run the other way. But the tendency of recent investigation and exploration has been to give greater credit to what have been deemed the exaggerated accounts of ancient historians and travelers, and to reveal indications of denser populations and more advanced civilizations than had before been suspected, as well as of a higher antiquity in the human race. And in basing our estimates of population upon the development of trade, the advance of the arts, and the size of cities, we are apt to underrate the density of population which the intensive cultivations characteristic of the earlier civilizations are capable of maintaining, especially where irrigation is resorted to. As we may see from the closely cultivated districts of China and Europe, a very great population of simple habits can readily exist with very little commerce and a much lower stage of those arts in which modern progress has been most marked, and without the tendency to concentrate in cities which modern populations show. Be this as it may, the only continent which we can be sure now contains a larger population than ever before is Europe. But this is not true of all parts of Europe. Certainly Greece, the Mediterranean islands, and Turkey in Europe, probably Italy, and possibly Spain, have contained larger populations than now, and this may be likewise true of northwestern and parts of Central and Eastern Europe. America also has increased in population during the time we know of it, but this increase is not so great as is popularly supposed, some estimates giving to Peru alone at the time of discovery a greater population than now exists on the whole continent of South America. And all the indications are that previous to the discovery, the population of America had been declining. What great nations have run their course, what empires have arisen and fallen in that new world which is the old, we can only imagine. But fragments of massive ruins yet attest a grander pre-Inca civilization. Amid the tropical forest of Yucatan and Central America are the remains of great cities forgotten ere the Spanish conquest. Mexico, as Cortez found it, showed the superimposition of barbarism upon a higher social development, while through a great part of what is now the United States are scattered mounds which prove a once relatively dense population, and here and there, as in the Lake Superior copper mines, are traces of higher art than were known to the Indians with whom the whites came in contact. As to Africa, there can be no question. Northern Africa can contain but a fraction of the population that it had in ancient times. The Nile Valley once held an enormously greater population than now, while south of the Sahara, there is nothing to show increase within historic times, and widespread depopulation was certainly caused by the slave trade. As for Asia, which even now contains more than half the human race, though it is not much more than half as densely populated as Europe, there are indications that both India and China once contained larger populations than now, while that great breeding ground of men from which issued swarms that overran both countries and sent great waves of people rolling upon Europe must have been once far more populous. But the most marked change is in Asia Minor, Syria, Babylonia, Persia, and in short, that vast district which yielded to the conquering arms of Alexander. Where were once great cities and teeming populations are now squalid villages and barren wastes. It is somewhat strange that among all the theories that have ever been raised, that of a fixed quantity to human life on this earth has not been broached. It would at least better accord with historical facts than that of the constant tendency of population to outrun subsistence. It is clear that population has here ebbed and there flowed. Its centers have changed. New nations have arisen and old nations declined. Sparsely settled districts have become populous, and populous districts have lost their population. But as far back as we can go without abandoning ourselves wholly to inference, there is nothing to show continuous increase, or even clearly to show an aggregate increase from time to time. The advance of the pioneers of people the advance of the pioneers of peoples has, so far as we can discern, never been into uninhabited lands. Their march has always been a battle with some other people previously in possession. Behind dim empires, vaguer ghosts of empire loom. That the population of the world must have had its small beginnings, we confidently infer, for we know that there was a geologic era when human life could not have existed, and we cannot believe that men sprang up all at once as from the dragon teeth sowed by Cadmus, yet through long vistas where history, tradition, and antiquities shed a light that is lost in faint glimmer, we may discern large populations. And during these long periods, the principle of population has not been strong enough fully to settle the world, or even so far as we can clearly see materially to increase its aggregate population. Compared with its capacities to support human life, the earth as a whole is yet most sparsely populated. There is another broad general fact which cannot fail to strike anyone who thinking of this subject extends his view beyond modern society. Malthusianism predicates a universal law that the natural tendency of population is to outrun subsistence. If there be such a law, it must, whenever population has attained a central density, become as obvious as any of the great natural laws which have been everywhere recognized. How is it then that neither the classical creeds and codes, nor in those of the Jews, the Egyptians, the Hindus, the Chinese, nor any of the peoples who have lived in close association and have built up creeds and codes, do we find any injunctions to the practice of the prudential restraints of Malthus, but that, on the contrary, the wisdom of the centuries, the religions of the world, have always inculcated ideas of civic and religious duty to the very reverse of those which the current political economy enjoins, and which Annie Besant is now trying to popularize in England? ? And it must be remembered that there have been societies in which the community guaranteed to every member employment and subsistence. John Stuart Mill says, Book 2, Chapter whatever, Section 2, that to do this without state regulation of marriages and births would be to produce a state of general misery and degradation. These consequences, he says, have been so often and so clearly pointed out by authors of reputation that ignorance of them on the part of educated persons is no longer pardonable. Yet in Sparta, in Peru, in Paraguay, as in the industrial communities which appear almost everywhere to have constituted the primitive agricultural organization, there seems to have been an utter ignorance of these dire consequences of a natural tendency. Besides the broad general facts I have cited, there are facts of common knowledge which seem utterly inconsistent with such an overpowering tendency to multiplication. If the tendency to reproduce be so strong as Malthusianism supports, how is it that families so often become extinct, families in which want is unknown? How is it then that when every premium is offered by hereditary titles and hereditary possessions, not alone to the principle of increase, but to the preservation of genealogical knowledge and the proving up of descent, that in such an aristocracy as that of England, so many peerages should lapse, and the House of Lords be kept up from century to century only by fresh creations. Oh, it's a question. For the solitary example of a family that has survived any great lapse of time, even though assured of subsistence and honor, we must go to unchangeable China. The descendants of Confucius still exist there and enjoy peculiar privilege and consideration, forming, in fact, the only hereditary aristocracy. On the presumption that population tends to double every 25 years, they should, in 2,150 years after the death of Confucius, have amounted to 859, 559, 193, 106, 709, 670, 198, 710, 528, souls. Sorry, I added an extra comma. Souls. Instead of any such unimaginable number, the descendants of Confucius, 2,150 years after his death, in the reign of Kangxi, numbered 11,000 males, or say 2,200 souls. This is quite a discrepancy, and is the more striking when it is remembered that the esteem in which this family is held on account of their ancestor, the most holy ancient teacher, has prevented the operation of the positive check, while the maxims of Confucius inculcate anything but the prudential check. Yet it may be said that even this increase is a great one. 22,000 persons descended from a single pair in the 2,150 years is far short of the Malthusian rate. Nevertheless, it is suggestive of possible overcrowding. But consider, we got way lost. Crap. I don't even know what page we were on. I know it was after 102, so you can safely go that far. 100, 102, okay. I'll start looking from here. Okay, so we're looking for Confucius. Okay, I think I found it. I think it was 112. Yet it may be said that even this increase is a great one. 22,000 persons descended from a single pair in 2,150 years is far short of the Malthusian rate. Nevertheless, it is suggestive of possible overcrowding. But consider, increase of descendants does not show increase of population. It could only do this when the breeding was in and in. Smith and his wife have a son and daughter, who marry respectively someone else's daughter and son, and each have 2 children. Smith and his wife would thus have 4 grandchildren, but there would be in the one generation no greater number than in the other. Each child would have 4 grandparents, and supposing this process were to go on, the line of descent might constantly spread out into hundreds, thousands, and millions, but in each generation of descendants there would be no more individuals than any previous generation of ancestors. The web of generations is like lattice work or the diagonal threads in cloth. Commencing at any point at the top, the eye follows lines which at the bottom widely diverge. But beginning at any point at the bottom, the lines diverge in the same way to the top. How many children a man may have is problematical, but that he has two parents is certain, and that these again had two parents each is also certain, unless fathers are raping their daughters or whatever, or sons fucking their mothers. Follow this geometrical progression through a few generations and see if it does not lead to quite a striking consequence as Mr. Malthus peopling of the solar systems. But from such considerations as these, let us advance to a more definite inquiry. I assert that the cases commonly cited as instances of overpopulation will not bear investigation. India, China, and Ireland furnish the strongest of these cases. In each of these countries, large numbers have perished by starvation, and large classes are reduced to abject misery or God damn it, this one's a question. But from such considerations as these, let us advance to a more definite inquiry, period. I assert that the cases commonly cited as instances of overpopulation will not bear investigation, period. India, China, and Ireland furnish the strongest of these cases, period. In each of these countries, large numbers have perished by starvation, and large classes are reduced to abject misery or compelled to emigrate. That's emigrate. But is this really due to overpopulation? Comparing total population with total area, India and China are far from being the most densely populated countries of the world. According to the estimates of M. Behem and Wagner, the population of India is but 132 to the square mile, and that of China 119, whereas Saxony has a population of 442 to the square mile, Belgium 441, England 422, the Netherlands 291, Italy 234, and Japan 233. There are thus in both countries large and unused or not fully used, but even in their more densely populated districts, there can be no doubt that either could maintain a much greater population in a much higher degree of comfort, for in both countries is labor applied to production in the rudest and most inefficient ways, and in both countries great natural resources are wholly neglected. This arises from no innate deficiency in the people, for the Hindu, as comparative philology has shown, is of our own blood, and China possessed a high degree of civilization and the rudiments of the most important modern inventions when our ancestors were wandering savages. It arises from the form which the social organization has in both countries taken, which has shackled productive power and robbed industry of its reward. In India, from time immemorial, the working classes have been ground down by exactions and oppressions into a condition of helpless and hopeless degradation. From ages and ages, the cultivator of the soil has esteemed himself happy if, of his produce, the extortion of the strong had left him enough to support life and furnish seed. Capital could nowhere be safely accumulated or to any considerable extent be used to assist production. All wealth that could be wrung from the people was in the possession of princes who were little better than robber chiefs quartered on the country, or in that of their farmers or favorites, and was wasted in useless or worse than useless luxury, while religion, sunken into an elaborate and terrible superstition, tyrannized over the mind, and physical force did over the bodies of men. Under these conditions, the only arts that could advance were those that ministered to the ostentation and luxury of the great. The elephants of the Raj blazed with gold of exquisite workmanship, and the umbrellas that symbolized his regal power glittered with gems. But the plow of the Ryot was only a sharpened stick. The ladies of the Raj's harem wrapped themselves in muslins so fine as to take the name of woven wind, but the tools of the artisan were of the poorest and rudest description, and commerce could only be carried on, as it were, by stealth. Is it not clear that this tyranny and insecurity have produced the want and starvation of India, and not, as according to Buckle, the pressure of population upon subsistence that has produced the want, and the want the tyranny? Says of the Reverend William Tennant, a chaplain in the service of the East India Company, writing in 1796, 2 years before the publication of the Essay on Population. This is the passage. When we reflect upon the great fertility of Hindostan, it is amazing to consider the frequency of famine. It is evidently not owing to any sterility of soil or climate. The evil must be traced to some political cause, and it requires but little penetration to discover it in the avarice and extortion of the various governments. The great spur to industry, that of security, is taken away. Hence no man raises more grain than is barely sufficient for himself, and the first unfavorable season produces famine. Passage continues. The Mongol government at no period offered full security to the prince, still less to his vassals, and to peasants the most scanty protection of all. It was a continued tissue of violence and insurrection, treachery and punishment, under which neither commerce nor arts could prosper, nor agriculture assume the appearance of a system. Its downfall gave rise to a state still more afflictive, since anarchy is worse than misrule. The Mohammedan government, wretched as it was, the European nations have not the merit of overturning. It fell beneath the weight of its own corruption, and had already been succeeded by the multifarious tyranny of petty chiefs, whose right to govern consisted in their treason of the state, and whose exactions on the peasants were as boundless as their avarice. The rents to government were, and where natives rule still are, levied twice a year by a merciless banditti. Momentarily. Okay, I know this is not a good stopping place, but it is apparently a stopping place. It's page 115, Progress and Poverty.